Hi, I want to tell you about Achievement Matters, a model for externally calibrating and assuring academic standards that's been applied in the accounting discipline over the last 3.5 to 4 years. My name's Freeman and I've been part of the project team. Let's start with some definitions. Learning outcomes is what a student or a learner knows, understands and can do. Better if they can do it independently, on demand and in a range of contexts. The standard is that definite level of performance excellence or attainment that's been established by authority or custom sometimes, or consensus. So a student getting a 50% is a common standard for passing a particular unit of study. Sometimes these academic standards at the end of a degree are called threshold learning outcomes. There's been a considerable concern about assessment for many decades and lots of research about it. In 2007, a major group of experts got together and concluded this particular tenet, that assessment is largely dependent upon professional judgment, and confidence in such judgments requires the establishment of appropriate forms for developing and sharing standards. Now, while they did some trials of that in 2009 in some discipline subject centres, this project took on and followed that up in accounting in Australia. And it was interesting because in the UK, they've been relying on external examiners for decades, and the Higher Education Academy concluded that the idea that a single external examiner could make a comparative judgment about the national standard of a particular program, they've said, has always been flawed. And that's why we need to have calibration. So the first thing that accounting did back in 2010 was to go through 3 cycles of consultation to agree what the minimum learning standards should be for any graduate of any degree in accounting in Australia. And you can see thousands of participants were involved in that. 5 learning standards were agreed: knowledge, application, judgment, communication, and self-management. Of course, any institution can have a particular bias or niche or focus, quantitative or public sector, but those 5 were the minimum. People could have more, they could have additional things, but these were the 5 that were necessary and agreed. In 2011 to 2014, there's been a process of assessing if those have been achieved. And it's really not like a high jump at all, because learning outcomes are much more difficult to assess than how high somebody can jump, which is why the picture here of experts judging at a diving competition is much more relevant. Experts need to look at the quality of the learning outcomes. So the analogy is really much like publishing research outcomes in a journal and meeting the standards of the reviewers there. So we got 2 peers from 17 institutions, 15 with universities and 2 others. And each institution was going to submit de-identified assessment data relating to each of the standards, and they're going to submit that online, and they submit that for double-blind peer review by their peers. So they submitted both a task and some sample student work of that task, being the student's work. However, we said that the reviewers could only look at and make those judgments only after they've participated in these calibration workshops, which were held the day before the external peer review. The editor of the journal, or the equivalent, really is the project leadership. The project leadership choose which standards are going to be reviewed and chooses which students' work will be submitted. And that was on purpose so that the reviewers were not going to prejudge and rank the work to try and work out which work was a credit and which was a distinction or a pass, and try to rank them simply. The editor allocates 2 external reviewers, and if they disagree, just like journal, a 3rd one would be brought in. At the end of it, they get a report, just like a journal submission, and the editor would facilitate these calibrations twice a year, and practitioners are invited so that the judgments around what the standard of what the graduate should be able to do was being informed by the practical users or employers of those graduates. More of this is available on this link. So here's an overview of how it worked. Prior to the workshop, each reviewer would be sent some assessment tasks and sample student work. They would assess whether the task met or would be able to, it was valid to be able to the students to demonstrate if they'd met the standard, and secondly, if the students' work met that standard. In the privacy of their own home or their own office, they'd remotely assess it, they'd enter their results online, and then at the end of a 2-week period, when everybody had submitted, they would then have the opportunity to compare their results and what others thought of the judgment of the standard, of the assessment task, and the standard of the quality of the students' work. They then come to a face-to-face workshop, and in small groups they would come to a consensus as a small group, and then they'd argue to and fro with the other groups to come to an agreement about what the quality was. And then they'd be given additional new student work to confirm they do it individually, do it as small groups, and then as a wider group. And then, of course, after they had now in a position, having come to some calibration, they were able to then apply it to judging real work. We used an online tool called Spark to collect the data. So here's an example where the academics would move the orange bar up or down, and when they make their judgment, and down the bottom of the screen you can see there that they have the ability to submit their reasons that justify why they gave that rating and advise what needs to be done to improve it. Feedback and feed forward, much like a journal reviewer does. And that orange bar can be moved anywhere on a continuum from 0 to 100%. After the deadline, you can see here the feedback of the different triangles shows what each of the different academics thought. And the triangle on the top shows what the academic from the home institution thought about the task. So you can see a range of responses. And down the bottom you can see all the reasons that were given as to why the task was viewed as acceptable or valid or not. And so you had the chance to look at that de-identified rating and feedback. So prior to each task, each workshop, we asked people how confident they were. In this case, we're looking at oral communication, and academics were 91% confident that they knew what was going on, how to judge it, and what a good task was. And here's the result of 33 people who came to the workshop, or were coming to the workshop. 12 thought it wasn't, 21 thought it would. The task was able to, for students to demonstrate that it met the task, met the standard or not. There's plus or minus 1 standard deviation, so the majority thought it was just above good enough, but the minimum and the maximum are those green triangles on the top. At the workshop, the small groups, the majority of the small groups thought it did not meet, and the one group thought it was, so there's these arguments, and the consensus was that it didn't meet, that the task was not suitable for students to be able to demonstrate the standard as agreed. We did the same thing with students' work. How confident are people in judging students' work meeting the national standard? Well, 85% thought they were pretty good. And once again, a range of variation of answers of what people thought student one's work standard was. Similarly, the group results. So you can see this variation before the workshop being reduced at the workshop. And we did controlled experiments to test this, and you can look, here's an example of all the different workshops that have been focusing on the different standards over the last 3.5, 4 years. And here's this controlled experiment, the before and after. You can see the standard deviation reduced from 14.8 to 8%, which was a probability of 0.002. and this, whereas a control group that had been matched with the participants, there is no change in their judgments. We asked people numerous times, do they think the project is going to help establish agreement about learning standards between the different accounting providers, and there's an overwhelming positive answer to that. And there's no doubt that a substantial amount of that comes down to the fact that we're having these calibration workshops. Thanks for listening. Any questions, please email or call Mark Freeman.